Good afternoon. And on behalf of the Niagara Foundation Virtual Lecture Series, I welcome you to this program on a new book titled The Humanity of Muhammad, A Christian View. During this hour, we're going to look at a recent scholarly account provided by Dr. Craig Considine using a sociological analysis of the example teachings of Muhammad and expressing to an audience in this country that may not know about the extent to which the Prophet, peace be upon him, embraced religious pluralism, envisioned a civic nation, stood for anti-racism, advocated for seeking knowledge, initiated women's rights, and followed the golden rule. Those of you that are with us today are joining by YouTube, and I want to share with you that you do have the opportunity to offer questions via the chat function. And in the later half of our program, we'll attempt to get to some of your questions. My name is Dirk Ficka. I am a long-term admirer of the Hizmet movement and a friend of the Niagara Foundation. And it's my privilege here today to moderate this discussion on behalf of the Niagara Foundation, which promotes interreligious understanding and engages in the public discourse in terms of religious and ethical perspectives that can be helpful and insightful to all. As we begin today, let me share with you that familiar commandment from the 10 Commandments of the Hebrew Scriptures. The commandment that says, "You shall not bear false witness." This is not only one of the 10 Commandments as a part of the covenant of the Hebrew people reflected in the Torah. It's a precept shared by Christians. It's a precept also shared as a central tenet of Islam, and some version of not bearing false witness to others is to be found in most all of the world's religious and spiritual traditions. I want to just mention here, of course, the more obvious meaning of do not bear false witness when it comes to Islam and the Muslim community in the United States and around the world is to not present false or misleading or self-serving characterizations of this community or their tradition. It's to avoid, as often is the case, we tend to present the best of our tradition while pointing out the worst of others' traditions. So we all have a moral obligation to understand Islam on its own terms, whether or not we agree with it, to understand Islam as the Muslim community understands it. And let me say that at this point, in terms of the history of the world, questions of a clash of civilizations, certainly in the climate in the United States at this contentious and polarizing time in our history. Perhaps those of religious conviction not only have a moral obligation not to bear false witness against their Muslim brothers and sisters, but perhaps to go out of their way to counter those false impressions that are being spread today about them. This not bearing false witness, but rather providing an accurate characterization, appreciative characterization of the Muslim tradition, I believe gets at the heart of this book that we're going to be discussing today. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Craig Considine. He is a professor and scholar, currently in the Department of Sociology at Rice University. He holds a BA from American University, a Master's of Sociology from Royal Holloway University of London, and he received his PhD from Trinity College at the prestigious University of Dublin. Beyond being a professor and a scholar, he's also a public intellectual, a global speaker, somebody who has authored many books and articles and has been a part of the public discourse. You've seen him on such public media sources as the New York Times, to Fox News, to Al Jazeera. You'll also find him as visible on social media. As we begin our conversation with him today, it's kind of fun to share with you that the Niagara Foundation, in trying to encourage young people in their community to read the book, they set up a competition. And several weeks ago, 40 to 45 young people were encouraged to read this book and then offer their reflections on it. And last night, they gathered together and 5 winners were announced. And as you meet Dr. Considine for the first time, he's going to be sharing the names of these 5 winners. Dr. Considine, welcome.
Reverend Dirk, thank you so much. It's great to see you. I don't think you remember meeting me, but we met at the I was there when you were speaking at the Turquoise Center in Houston, and I was actually really, I was quiet that day, and that's kind of rare for me, but I kind of just sat back and really absorbed what you have done in your life, because I see that as something that it provides a model in a lot of ways. And I'm always looking for people to inspire me as role models. And let me add too, as Reverend Dirk mentioned, I too am a friend of the Hizmet movement. This is a movement, a community, however you want to define it, that is close to the things that I care about in principle in my life as a human being, as a Christian, and as a citizen of this country. So, Reverend Dirk, thank you so much for that intro. And then, of course, thank you to the Niagara Foundation. I think I'll mention the names at the end to give a little suspense. And let me also add, Reverend Dirk, your comments on bearing false witness really resonated with me. One of the things that I just find so cruel and unnecessary and really destructive in terms of building bridges between Christians and Muslims is these sensational takes of Prophet Muhammad's life. You know, as someone that grew up in the Christian tradition, you know, if someone was defaming Jesus as they defame Muhammad, you know, in some of these public discourses, I mean, I too would be offended, because they're just not accurate. A lot of them are just simply inaccurate. And I've been blessed not only to read about Muhammad's life, obviously in books and in peer-reviewed journal articles and all that form of knowledge, but I've also come to understand Muhammad through the prism of Muslims themselves. You know, so like when I read about Muhammad's life and his character and his conduct, and then I see it being embodied by people who believe in him, I find that to be an important truth point, if you know what I mean, because it backs up the readings with the kind of real evidence. So this book is a kind of act to initiate a new type of discourse around Muhammad, because historically, going back really to the 630s, you know, Prophet Muhammad died in 632. But we have some primary sources that show us that in like 637 and 640, I believe it was John of Damascus was saying some pretty outrageous things about Muhammad that, you know, I think anyone would rightly be concerned with. So my book is an attempt to really just provide a new perspective, a new prism. And if you notice the chapters of the book, like they are sociological in nature, but I tried to find concepts that would make sense to people living in this country. So the idea of like pluralism, this idea of a civic nation, and what does that mean? The idea of racial equality. You know, these are kind of, I wouldn't necessarily say buzzwords, but a lot of people will be familiar with them. Women's rights as well, the importance of seeking knowledge. These are all the chapters of the book. So I'm trying to shape people's understanding and make them look at him as a person who was constructive, who was about building community, was about uplifting people, because all we see in the media and other forms in which Muhammad's life is discussed, it's all violence. It's war, or it's an issue pertaining to a 7th century tribal custom. So, the book is a my own kind of contribution and my own acknowledgement of his relevance. I find his life and legacy relevant to today. So yeah, why don't you chime in, Reverend Dirk? Reverend Dirk, excuse me, Reverend Dirk.
Well, thank you for that. And certainly the passion that we all hear in your voice right now is clearly expressed in the book. Can you say a little more about the kinds of readers that you had in mind?
Sure. So, I like to cast a big tent with my books. I don't think you necessarily have to be a Christian or a Muslim to benefit from this book. I think in the chapter that talks about a civic nation, and we have a lot of people in this country very active at the moment to try to push all of us as Americans to be our best selves, which is, the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All people are created equal. And you don't necessarily, you don't need to be a Muslim or a Christian to see the value, in any of that. And in this sense, I hope that a lot of American citizens would read this as a means to perhaps represent a potential bridge between two massive entities, America and Islam. Like there's these two monoliths that people like to depict, and we look at them as mutually exclusive, that they don't overlap. But indeed they do. They do overlap. So I've tried to cast a big tent. I think people who are also interested in spirituality and kind of looking at some of these ancient religious traditions in new light, especially sociological light, I think the book would be of interest. And I also, Reverend Dirk, kept the language pretty simple. There's not a lot of academic jargon in this book. And I really do think, even a freshman in high school or even younger, if the reader is a bit more advanced, I think they would be able to digest this. I'm a believer in communicating these potentially complex issues in words and terms that anyone can understand. Like what value, what value is it if it's the only people reading my article are, tenured professors? It just gets lost,
Well, in reading your book, I found it very accessible. I think that, of course, I was sensitive to the fact that everything you put in there has a scholarly foundation. So you've done your homework in the more academically technical sense. But you chose to describe the prophet's life. You gave some wonderful stories, both in terms of during the life of the prophet and the early period of the Muslim community's life, but also when you tie in, make connections with today. You did it through persons, you did it through descriptions and stories. So yes, I think you really succeeded there. I think it would be accessible to a wide audience. And you mentioned, there's kind of a cultural divide here, and that's the West and the Islamic world. But your book also addresses a religious divide as well, concurrently, and that would be between Islam and Christianity, as both as people of the book, but you wouldn't know that in much of the religious discourse today. And you describe yourself as an avowed Catholic and an Islamic apologist. Would you share a little bit about how you can hold those two things together?
Wow, thank you for that. That's a really good question, Reverend Dirk. Yeah, so when I say I'm an avowed Catholic, I think I should place it into context. Like my faith is deeply spiritual. I'm inspired by the history of saints, and I look for a lot of direction and guidance in saints, and this is part of our Catholic tradition. But personally, for me, when I say I'm an avowed Catholic, that's where my faith goes to. It's less, I gave a talk earlier today, and I actually mentioned that I might be a bad Catholic because, like, I'm not going to mass as much as I used to, or I'm not fulfilling some of the traditional obligations. But yes, I'm deeply passionate as well about Jesus's life and legacy. As someone who identifies as a Christian, I do so less so for big theological claims and more so for the kind of model that Jesus left in terms of how we as believers should behave in society. So as a Catholic and as a believer in Jesus, we know that Jesus made sincere efforts to bring people who are treated as outcasts, as outsiders, as peripheral members of society. And he was quite radical at the time for the type of people that he was bringing into his circles. He was less concerned about, politics and doing the right thing. And when I was a young man, 18, 19, for whatever reason, I was inspired by my faith and my understanding of Jesus, and to try to apply that to what was happening around us. And this was like 2001, 2002, 2003, where you had a faith of a quarter of the world's population, basically defamed on a regular basis in the media, in public discourse, in newspapers. And it just seemed wrong to me. It didn't seem like this type of presentation of people, which was false, going back to bearing false witness. It wasn't accurate. And it created these problems, which were very significant. And I thought, as a believer, as someone that in terms of religion is trying to aspire to follow in Jesus's footstep, for whatever reason, I became passionate about bringing people together. And it does so happen that I'm someone who would describe themselves as an Islamic apologist. And I do so, for those that may not be familiar with the term, to be an apologist is to defend something, really. I mean, it goes back to the ancient Greeks and when they were dealing with philosophy and arguments. And when I engage with the literature, when I engage with the theology and the sacred texts, there's a lot in the Quran and the Hadith that resonates with me as a Christian, and in some cases actually inspires me as a Christian. And these are the things that I would defend if you weren't a Christian or a Muslim either. You could be any human being, and if you stand for these principles, things like compassion and mercy and justice and oneness, humanity. These are the things I'm willing to defend. And to add to this, in all of my travels, and I know Reverend Dirk, that's one of the reasons why I was inspired by your talk in Houston, was because you were talking about your travels and how important they were and how they really shaped not only you as a human, but it shaped your knowledge. And for me, when I see passages of the Quran that I can understand as a Christian, and then I see Muslims who are my friends and my neighbors and strangers who are following those rules, those would be people I would want to defend. Absolutely. So it's really about, kind of moral conviction and principles. And I'm not trying to, say that I'm some type of, supreme moral figure by no stretch, but that's why I defend it. I think it's also following in the legacy of Jesus in many ways.
I know for many people of different traditions, to have an appreciative view or be inspired by another tradition somehow seems like a betrayal.
Yeah.
And yet, for others, to appreciate that and defend it is in fact a way to fulfill one's own religious tradition, and that's what I hear from
Mm,
you.
thank you. Yes.
And you're in good company in terms of those who wrote Vatican II and
Yes.
also the current Pope. So you're in
Yes.
good company there.
Thank you, Reverend Dirk. I don't hear that type of support often. So it actually, in all seriousness, that means a lot, to know that there are also people like me struggling in a similar way. I like that.
So I also appreciated the fact that you didn't dodge some of the tough issues in the book. And you begin with September 11th. And you're very frank, as an Islamic apologist, you're very frank that Christians in some countries in the world are being persecuted by predominantly Muslim communities or Muslim states or Muslim cultures. And you take that on directly. Would you like to? Because I think for a U.S. audience, okay, this is great. You're inspired by Islam and all of that. What about the varieties that we see of Islam in the world?
Very good point, Reverend Dirk. Very good question. And yeah, I'm certainly not one to back down from some of these difficult conversations of being critical. Like as an apologist, like you can still be critical as well. And I think that's important. So, when 2014, 2015, and years following, we saw ISIS kind of running around the Middle East, really causing a lot of havoc, not only on Christians but also Muslims. I mean, Muslims were probably the biggest victims of ISIS. But when we saw Christian churches being, arsoned or burned down, and we saw Christian libraries being destroyed, I'm talking about in Syria and Iraq, when we saw people being killed because they were Christian, that bothers me, not as a Christian necessarily. It bothers me as a human, right? I mean, I happen to be Christian, yes, but that is just fundamentally wrong. I mean, these were innocent people that really the only thing they did wrong was identify themselves as Christians, right? So we had the blatant and overt persecution of a religious minority population that we know through historical sources Muhammad had interacted with, right? So now we kind of juxtapose a group like ISIS or its sympathizers, because there's a lot of sympathizing groups. And then we have like the vision of Muhammad. And how do you reconcile these things? I'll give you a few examples. So with Prophet Muhammad, we have 615 and then 630 are two big years when we talk about his interactions with Christians. In 615, Muhammad, witnessing the persecution of his religious community in Mecca, had so much faith in a Christian ruler, the Negus of Abyssinia, King Ibn Abjar. He had so much faith in this person that he was willing to send a group of his people to leave everything behind. Leave your home, you go to a port, and you get on a boat. You don't know what's going to happen. There's a lot of similarities with refugees today. I mean, people are literally leaving everything behind. But Muhammad had faith in him, and knew that yes, there are good Christians in the world. For a group like ISIS, you're automatically eliminated for the simple fact that you describe yourself as a Christian. Like how do you reconcile that? And then the other example is in 630, when the Christians of Najran had visited Masjid al-Nabawi in Medina. And we know that these two parties came together, and inside the mosque, I mean, that in itself is an impressive feat. The fact that Muhammad actually welcomed these strangers, he's never met them before. They happen to be Christian, and he welcomes them into the mosque. ISIS would never do something like that. But even more than that, they engaged in dialogue. They talked about Christology, and they talked about their differences over it. And they agreed to disagree. they probably said, okay, I'm not going to agree with everything, but I get it. I see your angle. We don't believe that, but I see it. And that's really important. And then the best part of the story is when the Christians wanted to go pray, they were leaving the mosque door, and Muhammad said, no, turn around. You can, you're already in a place where worship is loved. This is a place of God. You can pray here. So just 2 or 3 examples. And then you juxtapose that with a group like ISIS, and you're just like, who's right, Muhammad or ISIS? It's a simple question.
And in your travels and your interaction with the Muslim community, again, what we don't often hear in the West or in the media is the self-critique within the larger ummah in the Muslim world.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I write about this in another book, like this idea that, Muslims don't condemn groups like ISIS. Like this can be factually disproven by press release statements that Muslim organizations feel obliged. For some reason, they feel like they have to respond to something that happens in Iraq or Syria. And Reverend Dirk, like, I know I often bring this up with my students, like as a Christian, have you ever been asked to condemn the violent behavior of a Christian somewhere else in the world? That question's never been asked to me. And I'm sure for you, it's probably the same. But that is not the case with Muslims. Whatever happens out there, oftentimes in American public discourse, people have to respond to it. So that's a complication, and how long should this go on for? How long should groups like Muslims keep condemning? I mean, aren't you fueling the cycle,
I know where I live here in Chicago, the umbrella Muslim organization here, over about 100 mosques and schools and community centers, they felt obligated every year to host a We Love America gathering on September 11th.
Yeah, it's tough too, Reverend Dirk, because like that's a good thing, Right. It's a good thing when people are being civically engaged, but then it's like, is this going to happen forever? Like, is it?
What made me think of this is they did it for 10 years and they were happy to do it. And then they said, okay, we've done it enough. We never were in favor of this. We've gone on record. So what your question of how long do you have to go about it? And they actually felt that over time to do it every year was somehow appeared to be defensive. Another very interesting thing that I don't think a lot of people in the US understand, when you think of this clash of civilization and the narrative that Islam is incompatible with democracy. I think a lot of folks listening to us right now would be intrigued about the familiarity of the founding fathers with the Muslim world. I think this would come to a great shock to a lot of people.
And this is for me as a scholar in previous years, like this was something I was really, really passionate about. And I actually kind of got started when I was doing my PhD writing for the Huffington Post. And the first article I wrote for them was called An Unlikely Connection, George Washington and Prophet Muhammad. And this caught the attention of what people refer to as the Islamophobia industry. And, people thought I was literally out of my mind. Fox News got wind of it. And, I guess the rest is history. But that article was actually just looking at George Washington's book called Rules of Civility, which was his kind of his expression of what it meant to be like an upright person, as a kind of as a gentleman living in colonial Virginia, and whatever that might mean. And then I looked at the life of Muhammad, and I found them actually making similar statements about the importance of like cleanliness, the importance of, when you shake someone's hand, like don't just shake the hand and be done with it, like be present, let people feel your sincerity. So that's a connection between the two. But if we open this up even further and we talk about two issues: one, political principles, and then the primary documents that the founding fathers left us. So let me start with the political principles. 622, Muhammad and the Ummah travel to Medina to essentially start anew, but also Muhammad was tasked with basically settling a generational long feud between the tribes of Medina. And there were pagan and Jewish tribes. And Muhammad, I love placing myself in some of these revered figures' shoes. Like, what were they thinking, So here's Muhammad, a complete outsider. No one really had met him. Maybe a small group of people have met him before. And he's got all this diversity in front of him. And he's like, well, what do I do? How do I handle this diversity? All of these religious differences and so on. And myself in his shoes, I'm thinking, well, it can't be about race. It can't be about religion. It can't be about ethnicity because everyone's different. And then we won't be a nation. So he said, let's create a civic nation. A civic nation is basically like a social contract. And in opting into this type of nation, you're basically saying, I belong here because of this constitution. I'm part of a political body that provides freedom of religion, freedom of worship, freedom of speech, the right to own private property. That was his way of gluing everything together. And really, when I think about that type of society, that vision for society in which your sense of belonging is not necessarily predicated on how you were brought into the world or what you believe. It's predicated on really the things that I love about this country, the United States, which is mentioned in the Declaration of Independence. It's noted in our Constitution. And we haven't always lived up to these ideals, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, all of that stuff. We haven't always lived up to them, but the idea has never gone away. And we've had waves of kind of fulfilling that promise. And we're still struggling with this today. So that, for me, when we think of an Islamic state with Muhammad as the head in 622 in Medina, as a civic nation, and then you look at the political documents of the founding of this country, quite interesting. There's some parallels. Now, the second point, real quick, the primary sources that we have. There's nothing better than a primary source if you're a scholar. And we know in the writings of Washington, Jefferson, and Benjamin Franklin, they were, as Denise Spellberg at the University of UT Austin, University of Texas Austin, she said the founding fathers imagined Muslims as future citizens, right? So there weren't a lot of Muslims at the time in the colonies. If they were probably enslaved as African Americans. But the founding fathers wanted the country to go to a certain place down the road. This is a sensitive subject because one might say, well, you're hypocritical. How could you write this beautiful document, the Declaration of Independence, and then still keep people enslaved and carry out a genocide? But they imagined Muslims. We know that Benjamin Franklin, when he was asked about the public financing of a place of worship in Philadelphia, it was supposed to be a kind of interfaith building. And he was being questioned on it. And he said, listen, basically, I'm summarizing. He's like, I don't even care if the Mufti of Constantinople, modern day Istanbul, if the Mufti wanted to come to Philadelphia, that would be fine. He would have a place. And think about the context here. The Ottoman Empire was quite powerful in the 18th century, and the Mufti was probably seen as like the arch enemy in this clash of civilizations. And then, of course, Jefferson, owns a copy of the Quran. As a scholar himself, I think he was largely concerned with the Sharia and how the Islamic tradition and the legal system can potentially influence the United States. And then we know, finally, with George Washington, we have several prime examples of him speaking directly about Muslims in a similar way of Spellberg putting it, imagining Muslims. These are all facts. I mean, they didn't use the term Muslim. They used the term like Mussulman, because that was the term that they used back then. But yeah, I'm a defender of that vision. But I also recognize that there was some serious double standards there. So Yeah.
And that dovetails with another very prominent idea you deal with in the book. And again, it goes back to the difference between a nation state based on race or ethnicity versus a civic nation state based on a social contract.
Mhm.
And then you, of course, in our country, it was not all human beings are created equal. It was all men are created equal, and African Americans were not a part of that. And of course, right now we know the poignancy. We're still dealing with that 2 centuries later. My view is that when a group is the other in the founding narrative of any nation state, so it's in the fabric of that.
It's a good point.
Very, very difficult to ever get out of it.
Oh man, go ahead, Reverend.
Well, I just that might explain, and you touch on it here, why Islam was attractive to African Americans in the past century. Would you mind speaking to that? Because again, I think a lot of people view that as anti-American.
Yes, really good points. And it got me to thinking the first one before I take the second one, this deeply historical institutional racism, I think is what we could call it. We've never reconciled that ever, honestly, and it's not just African Americans, it's, Native Americans and on down the line. I mean, even Western Europeans were the victims of it. I mean, it's pretty atrocious, but the issue is that we've never come together as a nation to really figure out the impact that it had. Like what the South Africans did following apartheid. They had these reconciliation committees where they brought like all the enemies, the people from both sides, and they brought them together and said, we need to come to terms with this. We need to make this right. And the problem with this country is like, these wrongs are kind of piling up on each other, and we're always kind of going back to the drawing board of having to deal with it. So I pray for our country. I really do. So yeah, the attractiveness of the Islamic tradition to African Americans. This is a subject that I dedicate an entire week to in my Muslims in American Society class. And we did it a couple weeks ago, and students are really moved by it. And without getting into the entire history of this, I will give one example that I talk about in the book, which is Malcolm X, his journey to perform Hajj in Mecca. And to give you a little bit of context, like pre-Hajj Malcolm X, if I can call him that, was a member of the Nation of Islam, and he was a very active member of the Nation of Islam. And if you're familiar with the Nation of Islam, I want to be careful here because some people would not even refer to them as Muslims. So I don't, just pointing that out. But the Nation was a very successful and powerful movement that empowered African Americans in this country who have been left behind in the system. And the Nation, starting in around 1930 or so, they were operating a lot in cities in the Midwest in the United States, so like Detroit, Chicago. And these cities were seeing an influx of migrants, African American migrants from the South. They call it the Great Migration, right? So they're leaving the South, they're leaving Jim Crow, they're trying to start a new life. They go to the Midwest and they realize, okay, things aren't really that much different. The Nation of Islam comes into these neighborhoods, and I think one way of putting it is that it gave them a sense of mission. It gave them a direction. It talked about self-empowerment. It talked about being self-sufficient communities. It also talked about cleaning up, let's say, like morals, things like that, so staying away from drugs and staying away from violence. So Malcolm X kind of embraced these narratives of Black pride, and rightfully so. I mean, in the atmosphere that they were growing up in. So the other side of the nation, though, is this kind of blatant idea of white man is the devil and black people are superior. So it's like literally flipping everything on its head. And Malcolm is, when he's speaking in the 50s and 60s, he's talking about, white people are not good. They're not good for us. And again, rightfully so. You can understand it. So fast forward when he goes to Hajj and he's walking around the Kaaba in Mecca, and he's doing his circles and he's looking around and he's basically seeing all of humanity represented, all skin colors, races, ethnicities, cultures, people from everywhere. And I suppose he had a kind of eureka moment. The light bulb went off and he's like, well, this is what Islam is. Islam comes from God. So this is what must be right. This kind of harmony between the races. So then he writes a letter. It's called The Letter from Mecca. It's in his autobiography. I think I have it back there. And he's basically saying, my new understanding of Islam matches the understanding and the expression of Islam as provided by Prophet Muhammad when he talks about racial equality. So.
Yeah, well, that was very poignant. And again, I think surprising view. Again, I think, lots of folks will be the first part of Malcolm X's journey. They'll quote that, they'll kind of pigeonhole him there and won't get into the second part after that epiphany and how that was truly rooted in an Islamic experience.
Very well said. Exactly.
Another, point of contention in the U.S. and I think would be very important for those who are just getting to know Islam is this depiction of the treatment of women in the Muslim world. And if you might not mind, if you would start with Muhammad's relations with women, because I'm very moved by the fact that not only was it a religious sensibility that he brought, but it was actually reflected in his own life history.
Absolutely. And I think this is really important when understanding a huge historical figure like Jesus, Muhammad, whoever it might be. Look at the relationships that they had, because we see people's character really come out and it becomes more kind of recognizable to us. It becomes more familiar. So let's start with Khadija. I think she should be the starting place for any conversation on this idea of like women in Islam. And if you think about the facts at least as they're kind of related to us and reported to us, she was 15 years his elder. She had more resources, arguably had more influence, had a higher status, and she was materially well off. Okay. And then Muhammad, being part of the family that he was part of, but he wasn't at that level. He wasn't at that level. He was known as Al-Amin, the trustworthy, and, he was well liked and well respected. But, Khadija was a different ballgame, and he was not intimidated at all by entering into a sacred vow and relationship with someone who is a lot more powerful than he was. And I just think right there, it just kind of hits you like what type of man would do something like that? I mean, so he saw in her principles, right? He saw in her maybe an admiration for her successful business. Maybe he saw her interacting with other merchants and he saw something in her that he loved. And one of my favorite elements of the relationship too is when Muhammad is coming down in 610 from the cave in Mount Hira, and he, just meets Angel Gabriel, and he has this revelation, and he comes home, and, he asks Khadija, "What do you think happened?" I mean, the question alone suggests that he appreciated and valued her insight. She was someone that could actually potentially add some light on a very mysterious event. And we also know that she was, the first believer outside of Muhammad. She said, "No, you're right. Powerful person, knew truth and righteousness when it's in front of her." And she said, "No, you're right." And then, of course, with Aisha, and I mention this in the book. With Aisha, like there's a narration that says, and like Muhammad is talking to one of his peers, and the peer was asking questions about Aisha because Aisha was quite firm, if I could put it that way, quite a strong woman with intellect. And Muhammad was kind of joking with this man. He's like, "Well, listen, if you want to get into it with Aisha, if you want to get into the debate, you can do it, but just be ready, because she's going to come after you." And he liked that. He liked that energy that are coming out of women. They're human beings. They have inspirations, aspirations. They know their skills, and these skills should be tapped into. So I think just those two examples, I think, are poignant.
And really, in terms of the subjugation of women throughout human history, and certainly in the West until very recently. I learned recently that the rule of thumb, we always say a rule of thumb, right? Well, that came from British law in the 18th century, that a husband could not beat his wife with anything a stick wider than his thumb. So we have this characterization of women in Islam. And in the 6th century, didn't Muhammad engineer a move from women as property to a civil contract?
Yeah, absolutely. And I talk about this in the book. Really, Muhammad, in addition to this context of prophet or religious leader, he was also a revolutionary. Like, this is a person who came with ideas that fundamentally shook the pillars of a society. So women were largely, according to the history books, were largely treated as kind of, not like Khadijah. Khadijah was an exception, but, kind of submissive. They should stay away from the mainstream. They should, know their role in a really derogatory way. And Muhammad comes and, initiates several new initiatives, like even the right to divorce, the right to own property. But I think even more importantly is the ending of female genital, not female genital mutilation, infanticide, excuse me, where, little girls, I just had a little girl. I mean, I couldn't imagine this happening. And this isn't unique to Muslims either. This was a practice that happened. I know the Spartans, going back to ancient Greece, not only would they dispose of girls, but they would dispose of men that didn't look strong. So this was something that happened for centuries. And Muhammad basically ended this practice of literally throwing away people. Pope Francis refers to this need of all of us moving beyond this throwaway culture, that we just dismiss people and write them off, and we just move on. Muhammad came to end that, and a lot of people will argue and criticize Muhammad in light of modern developments with women's rights, and that's a dicey game. The best way for me to kind of frame it is that when he was operating in the 6th and the 7th century, it was completely new. It was what we would consider progressive. It was a revolutionary idea to liberate people. So I think big picture, in an essentialist view, these are the things that I think are helpful in understanding who Muhammad really was to his core.
And as our time is beginning to wind down here, the title of the book, The Humanity of Muhammad. And as a Christian, myself, we've spent 2 centuries wrestling with the divinity and the humanity of Jesus. How much of this, how much of that, how do they interact? And tending toward, did Jesus ever make a mistake? Would he have added up numbers wrong? How could he? If he's God, why would he ever do that? I mean, we wrestle with that. It is absolutely crystal clear in Islam that Muhammad is a human being. Um, I hope I'm not being offensive here, that the Quran conveys what we might say occasional character flaws or mistakes that Muhammad made that he then reconsidered, which for some Muslims I know endear him to them even more. Can you just share, what does the depth of the humanity of Muhammad mean in Islam? And how is that a vehicle in some ways for sharing the message of Islam?
Really good questions, Reverend Dirk. These are great. I think if I had to choose like a phrase for people to kind of walk away and say, this is what the humanity of Muhammad is, it would probably be the last chapter of the book before the conclusion, which is the golden rule. And we understand the golden rule, to be treat others how you want to be treated. Though, Reverend Dirk, have you ever heard of the platinum rule?
No, I haven't.
I know. Sorry to bring this up, but actually, I was with an Episcopalian community from Nebraska, Omaha, and someone said you should use the platinum rule, which is treat others how they want to be treated, rather than you. But anyways, that's what the golden rule is, and I think I like to think of people like Jesus and Muhammad and all of these great figures throughout history. They don't even need to be religious necessarily, but like, how did they act at a very micro sociological level? So like when they walked into a room, how did they handle themselves? How did they treat strangers? That's often like a litmus test. How did they treat their enemies? And of course, how did they treat their friends and their loved ones and their community members? And for me, when I think of Jesus's life, and really being bold in terms of making connections with people that have been forgotten, people that have been exiled, people that have lost hope. I see a lot of that in Muhammad, in his ability, or not his ability, his interest in making a community more whole, making a community more in the image of God, which is fundamentally equal. It's one of righteousness. It's one of deep truth. So yeah.
That's what struck me about his humanity.
Yeah, it's just, I'll give you one of the stories too that really inspired me was, I think it was I forget who related it, but one of the old scholars, and there was a Jewish funeral procession passing by Muhammad, and Muhammad and some of his companions were at the road, and Muhammad sees this Jewish funeral procession coming forward. So he must have seen something that ignited the reference to Judaism. This is in Medina, and Muhammad stands up, and some of the companions said, "What are you doing? This is a Jewish person. We're Muslims." And he turns to his companion and he just says, "Is it not a human soul?" Right? So again, going back, seeing people, Reverend Dirk, first as human beings. I know it sounds like overly simplistic, but I think it's really, really important. Like first and foremost, we're humans. Before all of these other categories, these categories just give us these perceptions, these massive perceptions, and we don't know what to do with it. We don't know how to decipher it. But if we start talking about things that all of us as humans struggle with, deal with, what is it like to be a mom, a dad, a son, a daughter, an employee? These are the things that I think can really break it down. And I think these are the things that Muhammad was passionate about. Just being good, being a good person, and whatever that means.
Sure. Okay. Well, the time has flown by here, and So let's do two things. Number one, some of these students who read your book and
Yes.
have thought about it and all, if they're watching, we're glad you've been a part of us. And five of you have distinguished yourselves. And I wonder if you might just read their names.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so the 5 lucky winners are Sania Uslu, number 2, Isra, number 3 is Halima, number 4 is Maliha, and number 5 is Bushra, yes, Janova. I hope I'm pronouncing that right.
Yes.
So congratulations. That's awesome.
Yeah.
And thank you for reading.
Yes. A final thought from you, a hope. How about a hope?
A hope. A hope. I think it's this: to be brave, in our lives. I feel like the current climate that we live in this country, it's easy to have despair. It's easy to isolate. It's easy to be afraid that you may not be understood, that people may not accept you. And these feelings, if not kind of tackled and grappled with, can just reproduce some of the old divisions that we have because we let the fear get the best of it, us. My dad refers to something. He was in the military, Reverend Dirk. I don't know if you've heard of this, but FUD. You ever heard of FUD? Fear, uncertainty, and doubt.
Mm.
Fear, uncertainty, and doubt. These 3 things can paralyze us as humans. And the antidote to fear, I think one of them is knowledge, and knowledge not simply by means of books and your college degrees and stuff like that. That's all important, but a life experience type knowledge where you have friends, you have memories, you have stories. These are the things that can be created, but you have to create it. You have to go out. You can't be fearful. You have to send that email to the person that you never think is going to respond to you. Be the change that you want to see, I'd say.
Well, Dr. Craig Considine, I think everybody will agree that you are as compelling in person as you are in terms of the book that you've given us. I want to thank you for that, and thank you for the way you are a public intellectual in today's world, bringing that scholarly, hard-nosed, intellectually sharpened perspective, but in a way that's engaging, really addresses us in terms of our current questions and situation. A thanks to the Niagara Foundation for this hour, making it possible, and for the wider HISMET community through the Blue Dome Publishing that has published your book and is making sure that your message and your perspective is going to be widely disseminated. We'll keep looking for you in the public discourse. And to all that have joined us tonight, salam.
Thank you, Reverend Dirk. That was amazing. And if you're ever in Houston, please let me know. I would love to host you for dinner and even invite you to class. I'm really inspired by you. And as I mentioned, I never got a chance to talk to you that one day at the Turquoise Center. So God willing, one day soon, we'll meet in person and make the connection even stronger. I thank you sincerely. Thank you so much.
I look forward to that.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes.